The story of John Eudes begins in a small Norman village called Rye, in the gentle countryside of France, where the rolling meadows and orchards seemed to bow to the changing seasons in slow, dignified rhythm. It was there on November 14th, 1601, that the first cries of a child rang out in the Eudes household. The house was a sturdy, modest dwelling, smelling of fresh bread and the faint scent of beeswax from candles his devout mother kept burning before a little wooden crucifix. His father, Isaac Eudes, was a farmer of upright character, and his mother, Martha Corbin, was a woman of deep prayer whose faith seemed to set the tone of their home. John was the first of 7 children, and from his earliest days, it was clear that something in his nature was tuned to higher things. He was a lively boy, yes, but his liveliness did not often spill into mischief. Even when playing with other children among the apple orchards or skipping smooth stones on the stream that wound its way past the village, his face carried a certain brightness, as though his thoughts often ran deeper than the moment's game. When John was about 5, his mother began to notice how long he would linger before the family's crucifix. She would call him for supper, and he would answer with a soft, distracted voice, not looking away from the figure of Christ. Once, when she teased him about staring so long, he answered with the simple seriousness of a child, "I am thinking of how much he loves us." Martha, hearing that, felt both awe and the faint ache of a mother who knew her son's life might be claimed by God in a special way. The rhythms of rural life in Rye were simple but demanding. Before dawn, the household stirred to tend the animals and prepare for the day's work. John would sometimes carry a small pail of water for his father, or gather kindling for the hearth. But there were also moments of stillness, winter evenings when the wind sighed around the eaves, and the family gathered for prayer, their voices blending into a soft chant of psalms. John absorbed these moments deeply, not as routine, but as encounters with something holy. When he turned 12, his parents arranged for him to study at the Jesuit college in Caen, a city whose narrow medieval streets and grand churches stirred his young imagination. For a boy from the countryside, it was like stepping into a larger world, one filled with books, scholarly disputations, and the sound of Latin prayers echoing off vaulted ceilings. He was quick to learn, and his teachers soon noticed his sharp mind and remarkable memory. But what struck them more was his prayerfulness. Even at that age, John would slip into the chapel between classes, kneeling in silence, his gaze fixed not on the floor but upward, as though waiting for an answer from someone unseen. There was, however, another side to young John, a warm, open manner that drew others to him. While he loved study, he was not aloof. He listened when classmates confided their troubles, and he had a way of speaking that gave comfort without condescension. Some later said it was during these years that the seed of his future mission, bringing the mercy of Christ to wounded hearts, first began to sprout. In 1619, at 18 years of age, John felt the inward pull of vocation more strongly than ever. The Jesuits had trained him well, but his heart leaned toward the oratory, the society of priests founded by Cardinal Pierre de Barreau, whose emphasis on the grandeur of Christ and the sanctity of the priesthood matched the longing in John's soul. He was accepted into the oratory in Paris in 1623, and the move from Caen to the bustling capital was a leap into a world of intense spiritual and intellectual formation. The Paris of John's youth was a city alive with contrasts. The elegance of court life only streets away from crushing poverty, the solemn chanting of religious processions mingling with the cries of market sellers. Here, John deepened his theological studies and immersed himself in prayer, meditating especially on the mystery of the Incarnation, the unfathomable humility of the Son of God taking flesh. There were nights when he remained in the chapel until the candles guttered low, his head bowed, whispering prayers for strength to serve worthily. One of the pivotal moments of his early priesthood came not in the safety of the seminary, but in the midst of a deadly plague. It was 1627, and an outbreak swept through Caen and the surrounding region. People died by the hundreds, and fear gripped the city. Many fled, but John could not bring himself to leave the afflicted. He volunteered to minister to the sick, hearing confessions, bringing the sacraments, and comforting the dying. To avoid bringing contagion to the oratory house, he made a remarkable decision. He would live in a wine barrel in a field outside the city. For months, that humble barrel became his shelter. By day he moved among the plague-stricken, often entering houses where the air was heavy with the smell of sickness and decay. By night he returned to his barrel, offering prayers beneath the stars. This strange, self-imposed exile revealed not only his courage, but his willingness to sacrifice comfort and safety for the sake of souls. Many would later say that those months were a crucible, forging in him the unshakable resolve that would mark his entire priestly life. When the plague finally subsided, John returned to more conventional ministry, but he carried with him the faces of those he had anointed, the cries of the dying, and the deep conviction that the love of Christ must be preached with both words and deeds. This conviction would soon blossom into a mission that would reshape the spiritual life of France, but that lay still ahead, waiting like a chapter not yet opened. The years after the plague tested John's stamina in a different way. His superiors in the oratory recognized his gifts for preaching, and soon he was traveling from town to town, carrying little more than a Bible, his breviary, and an iron will to awaken hearts to God. His early missions were modest affairs, a week in a parish here, 10 days in a small village there, but they were marked by something people could not forget. John spoke with a clarity and fervor that pierced the soul. He did not thunder down accusations from the pulpit. Instead, he painted vivid images of Christ's love and mercy, so that people felt not scolded, but invited. His words carried the heat of conviction, but also the tenderness of one who had suffered alongside the poor and dying. One mission took him to a small fishing village on the Normandy coast. The town's little church was nearly empty on his first evening sermon, the sea wind rattling its wooden shutters. By the third night, the entire village had crammed inside, and the doors stood open for those who could not fit. People stood outside in the cold, straining to hear his voice through the doorway. At the end of the week, hardened fishermen came to confession for the first time in decades, their eyes wet. The parish priest later wrote to the oratory, "I have seen many fine preachers pass through here, but this one leaves the fragrance of heaven behind him." John's success, however, brought with it a challenge. He was increasingly aware that the fruit of these missions faded quickly unless there was careful follow-up. The priests in some parishes were overwhelmed, unable to sustain the work begun in a single week of preaching. His heart burned with a desire to remedy this, to form not just individual souls, but holy priests who could shepherd their flocks with zeal and skill. This desire will become one of the cornerstones of his life's mission. But before that vision could take shape, John faced another crucible. In the winter of 1631, another wave of plague struck, this time in a region near Coutances. Remembering his vow to serve wherever Christ's poor suffered most, he once again threw himself into the work. Day after day he walked into houses thick with a feverish stench, whispering absolution to those too weak to speak, placing the sacred host on trembling tongues. His face became well known in the streets, not because he sought attention, but because he carried the consolation of the church into the heart of fear. It was during this time that John experienced one of the mystical moments that would mark his life. Late one evening, after leaving the home of a dying man, he stepped into the frozen street. The stars shone with strange brilliance, and the night was so still that the crunch of his boots on snow seemed the only sound in the world. Suddenly, an overwhelming awareness of the heart of Jesus filled him, not as an idea, but as a living, burning reality, vast enough to hold a whole world suffering and still overflow with love. He sank to his knees right there in the snow, tears freezing on his cheeks, murmuring, "Your heart, O Jesus, is the furnace in which all coldness is consumed." When the epidemic passed, John returned to the oratory, but the fire from that night never left him. It would eventually lead him to become one of the great apostles of devotion to the Sacred Heart. But in those years, the vision remained like a seed, hidden in the soil of his ministry. In 1633, Cardinal de Barreau died, and the oratory entered a time of transition. John, though deeply loyal, began to feel an increasing restlessness. He loved oratorians, yet he felt called to something more focused, a work dedicated entirely to the formation of holy priests and the renewal of Christian life through missions. His restlessness turned into conviction in 1643, when he founded a new congregation, the Congregation of Jesus and Mary, known simply as the Eudes. The founding was no grand event. It began in a modest house in Cannes, with a handful of companions and very little money. Yet the air seemed charged with purpose. The first Eudes seminary opened in Cannes in 1643, and the men who entered soon discovered that John was not content with mere academic training. He insisted that future priests be formed as men of deep prayer, charity, and pastoral skill. He taught them to spend long hours before the Blessed Sacrament, to visit the poor and the sick, and to preach with words that came from the heart as well as the mind. John's missions continued in parallel with the seminary work, and he brought his students into the field with him. It was not unusual to see him in a country parish, preaching from a pulpit in the morning, visiting bedridden parishioners in the afternoon, and then instructing seminarians late into the night. His stamina was legendary. Rest, he would tell them with a smile, will come in heaven. One mission in particular left a deep mark on those who accompanied him. It was in a town racked by both material poverty and moral decay. John began the mission not with fiery condemnation, but with a week of silent preparation, visiting homes, blessing children, tending to the sick, speaking gently to shopkeepers. When he finally mounted the pulpit, the whole town was there. His theme was the mercy of God, and by the end, the hardest hearts in the place seemed to have melted. Confessions went on for days. One hardened man, known for his cruelty, approached John and broke down completely, weeping in his arms. That man later became one of the mission's strongest supporters, funding a chapel for the town. It was also during these years that John's devotion to the heart of Mary began to blossom into something the church had never seen before. He believed that the heart of Mary, her interior life, her virtues, her love for God, was a model for every Christian soul. He began writing and preaching about it, speaking of Mary's heart as the perfect echo of the heart of Jesus. His words were not mere theology. They were born from long hours of contemplation. Those who heard him speak on this theme often remarked that his voice took on a softness, as though he were speaking of someone very near. By the end of the 1640s, John Eudes was no longer just a gifted preacher or founder. He was a man whose life was becoming a living sermon on the love of the hearts of Jesus and Mary. The seed planted in his childhood, the gaze fixed on the crucifix, the quiet awe in prayer, had grown into a great tree whose branches would shelter countless souls. And yet his greatest works were still ahead, for the devotion he carried was about to find its fullest expression. By the early 1650s, John's reputation as both preacher and spiritual father had spread far beyond Normandy. Bishops from distant dioceses began to write to him, pleading for missions in their territories. His congregation of Jesus and Mary, still young, now had several houses and seminaries, and the men he trained were beginning to bear fruit in their own ministries. Yet John never allowed himself to sink into the role of a mere administrator. The road, with its unpredictable encounters and raw, unpolished humanity, still drew him. One winter, he received an urgent request from a bishop whose diocese had suffered a deep moral collapse. A recent war had left the region in shambles. Villages burned, families scattered, and poverty everywhere. Worse still, the church's presence had weakened. Priests were overburdened or discouraged, and the faithful had grown indifferent. John accepted the mission without hesitation. When he arrived, the sight was disheartening. The parish church was half empty even on Sundays, its roof sagging under years of neglect. Children wandered the streets unsupervised, and taverns seemed busier than the market square. John did not begin with sermons. Instead, he spent his first days walking through the muddy lanes, visiting homes, and asking the people about their lives. He listened more than he spoke, learning the wounds of the town. At last, he began preaching each evening. His first sermon was not a rebuke, but a story, the parable of the prodigal son. He told it slowly, letting each phrase sink in, painting the father's joy so vividly that some listeners wept. "This," he concluded, "is the joy of God when you return to him. Do not believe you are too far gone. You are not. His arms are open." Over the next 2 weeks, the church filled each night, until even the square outside was crowded. The fruits were tangible. Marriages were reconciled, stolen goods returned, and the poor cared for by neighbors who had once ignored them. The bishop, astonished, told John that the mission had done more in a month than years of effort had achieved. But John deflected the praise, pointing always to the hearts of Jesus and Mary, whose love, he insisted, was the real agent of conversion. Amid these labors, John began to devote serious thought to something that had been stirring within him for years, the need for a liturgical feast honoring the Sacred Heart of Jesus and the Immaculate Heart of Mary. In his mind, these devotions were not separate streams but one river, flowing from the mystery of God's love revealed in the Incarnation. He envisioned a celebration that would draw the faithful into deeper union with Christ and his mother, not as distant figures, but as living hearts beating with love for them. The idea met resistance. Some accused him of novelty, others of excessive sentimentality. But John pressed forward, composing offices and masses for these feasts, drawing from Scripture, the fathers of the Church, and his own prayer. His office of the Sacred Heart of Mary was celebrated for the first time in 1648, and the office of the Sacred Heart of Jesus in 1672, decades before the devotion was spread widely through the revelations to St. Margaret Mary Alacoque. One summer afternoon, while working on the text for the office of the Sacred Heart, John experienced another profound mystical grace. Sitting at his desk in Cannes, the window open to the scent of blooming jasmine, he found his mind suddenly filled with an image of Christ's heart as a great sun, radiating light that touched every corner of the world. In that light he saw faces, poor farmers, weary mothers, repentant sinners, all drawn toward the heart as though it were their true home. The vision lasted only minutes, but it left him trembling. From then on, his preaching on the Sacred Heart carried a depth that could only have come from having seen it with the eyes of the soul. The demands on him grew, but John was tireless. His students sometimes marveled that he could preach in the morning, teach theology in the afternoon, visit the sick in the evening, and then spend half the night writing. He had a gift for making people feel they were the only person in the world at the moment he spoke to them. A young seminarian once confided to him about doubts and fears of unworthiness for the priesthood. John listened, placed a hand on the young man's shoulder, and said, "The heart of Jesus is not searching for the worthy, but for the willing. Be willing, and he will do the rest." That seminarian later became a zealous parish priest, and often spoke of that conversation as a turning point. Not all of John's encounters were peaceful. On several occasions, he faced open hostility from those who resented his reforming zeal. In one town, tavern keepers, furious that his preaching was cutting into their profits, tried to disrupt the mission by sending rowdy drinkers to heckle him during a sermon. John paused, looked directly at the troublemakers, and calmly invited them to meet him afterward. Most left in embarrassment, but a few stayed, and one of them, years later, sought John out to thank him for the kindness that had softened his heart. By the late 1660s, John's vision was spreading. The Eudes seminaries were forming priests across France, and his missions were leaving trails of renewed parishes. His devotion to the hearts of Jesus and Mary, once seen as eccentric, was gaining traction. Bishops began approving the liturgical offices he had composed, and the faithful embraced them with enthusiasm. Through it all, John remained anchored in his own prayer life. No matter how busy the day, he rose early to spend an hour before the Blessed Sacrament in silence. Those who knew him best said it was in those hours that his strength was renewed. He prayed not only for his own soul, but for the entire church, often naming aloud the towns and people he had visited, as though presenting them one by one to the heart of Christ. As the 1670s began, John was entering the final, most fruitful chapter of his ministry. The seeds he had planted decades earlier were ripening, and his life was becoming the living embodiment of his own teaching. That the hearts of Jesus and Mary are inexhaustible wells from which all the world can drink. The early 1670s were a time of both public triumph and private intensity for John Eudes. His congregation of Jesus and Mary now had a reputation for producing priests of uncommon zeal, and bishops sought his help not only for parish missions but for the renewal of their entire clergy. Yet John's vision was never content with simply maintaining what had been achieved. He believed the church was called to constant growth in holiness, and he pursued that aim with the same fervor he had shown in his earliest days. In 1670, he launched a mission in the city of Rennes that became one of the most remarkable undertakings of his career. The city, though prosperous in trade, was spiritually lukewarm. Many of the wealthy attended Mass for appearance's sake, while the poor were largely neglected. John began his mission by gathering the clergy of the city for a week-long retreat before addressing the laity. His reasoning was simple. If the shepherds' hearts are set aflame, the sheep will feel the warmth. The retreat was intense. Each day began before dawn with meditation, and ended with examinations of conscience that lasted into the night. John's conferences to the priests were penetrating but never harsh. He spoke of the dignity of the priesthood, likening it to carrying the Eucharist within one's own soul. If the chalice must be of gold, he told them, how much more the heart that holds the living Christ? By the end of the week, several priests who had grown indifferent were visibly changed. One even wept openly, asking John to hear his confession after years of negligence. When the laity's part of the mission began, John's sermons drew immense crowds. The cathedral's massive doors stood open to accommodate the overflow, and townspeople said it felt as though the city itself was pausing to listen. Confession lines were so long that priests worked in shifts through the night. Merchants closed their shops for several days so they could attend the exercises. It was as if a fresh wind had blown through Rennes, sweeping away years of spiritual dust. But John's work in those years was not only public. Behind the scenes, he was laboring to give his devotions to the hearts of Jesus and Mary a permanent place in the church's life. The office of the Sacred Heart of Jesus, which he had composed, was ready to be celebrated more widely, and he encouraged bishops to adopt it. He wrote to them with the careful reasoning of a theologian and the warmth of a friend, explaining how these feasts would not distract from Christ, but lead souls more deeply into his mystery. Some letters brought swift approval. Others brought cautious replies. But John knew that the seed he was planting might take decades to bear fruit. He often compared his work to that of a farmer sowing in the spring. You do not see the harvest as you sow, but you sow because you believe the grain will rise. Around this time, he began to write more extensively, producing treatises and spiritual works that distilled his years of prayer and preaching. His book, The Devotion to the Adorable Heart of Jesus, was not a dry manual, but a living exhortation, filled with images drawn from Scripture and daily life. He described the heart of Christ as a great furnace of love in which the coldest soul can be warmed and from which the smallest spark can set the world ablaze. His words bore the weight of someone who had lived what he was describing. One of the more extraordinary episodes of these years occurred during a mission in a rural parish far from the major cities. The people there had been embroiled in bitter feuds for years, dividing families and even causing violence. When John arrived, the tension was palpable. Some villagers refused to even enter the church if their enemies were inside. Instead of beginning with doctrine, John chose a bold gesture. On the first night of the mission, he placed a large crucifix in the center aisle and invited everyone to come forward not to him, but to the cross. "You who will not look upon one another," he said, "look here and see the one who looks upon you both with love." Slowly, hesitantly, people began to move. Two men, enemies for over a decade, approached from opposite sides, knelt before the crucifix, and, without a word, embraced. The next day, the whole village was buzzing, not with gossip, but with reconciliation. By now, John's influence extended even into the royal court. Some members of the French nobility sought his counsel, intrigued by his reputation as a preacher of both truth and mercy. He never softened his message for them. Instead, he urged them to use their wealth and position for good of the poor and the defense of the church. To one noble woman, concerned about her spiritual dryness, he wrote, "Do not measure your prayer by what you feel, but by the love with which you persevere. Even dryness, when endured with love, is a sweet offering to the heart of Jesus." As the 1670s wore on, John's health began to show signs of strain. Decades of constant travel, preaching, and administration were taking their toll. Yet he refused to slow down. "Heaven," he would say with a wry smile, "is for resting. Earth is for loving and laboring." His companions often found him writing long after midnight, candlelight flickering over the pages, as he worked on a new book or composed letters to his seminarians. One of his final great joys in this period was seeing the Feast of the Sacred Heart of Jesus celebrated with solemnity in several dioceses, including Rennes and Autun. For John, this was not merely a personal vindication, but the fulfillment of a lifelong desire, that the Church should honor in its liturgy the love of Christ's heart. He knew the devotion was still in its infancy, but he was confident that it would one day spread throughout the world. By the closing years of the decade, John was a man in his 70s, still aflame with a mission that had driven him since his youth. The road ahead would be shorter now, but his pace hardly slackened. The seeds he had sown were growing in hidden and visible ways, and he would press on until his last breath to water them with his prayers, his preaching, and his tireless charity. By the dawn of the 1680s, John Eudes had spent more than half a century in relentless apostolic labor. He was now recognized across France as a pioneer of parish missions, a father of seminaries, and the principal architect of public devotion to the hearts of Jesus and Mary. Yet the man himself wore no air of achievement. If one met him in the streets of Cannes, he might be mistaken for an ordinary parish priest, his black cassock often dusted from travel, his satchel filled with well-worn books, and his eyes bright with that same readiness to listen that had marked him in youth. The last active decade of his life was a tapestry of tireless work woven with moments of deep prayer. Even as age bent his shoulders and slowed his step, he continued to preach missions. His companions often urged him to rest, but John would smile and say, "Rest is a fine thing, but love will not let me." His voice, though softer than in earlier years, seemed to carry even greater weight. People listened not merely to the words, but to the man whose whole life gave those words credibility. One of his most remarkable late missions took place in a rural diocese where the bishop, an old friend, asked him to rekindle faith in several neglected parishes. John began in a village where the church door hinges were rusted from disuse and the altar linens moth-eaten. His first act was not to preach, but to kneel silently before the tabernacle for nearly an hour. Word spread quickly, the holy priest who prays without speaking. That night, the villagers filled the church for his opening sermon. By the close of the mission, not only was the church repaired and the altar addressed, but the people had formed a confraternity dedicated to the Sacred Heart, promising to gather regularly for prayer and works of charity. In these years, John also deepened his work as a writer. He published several treatises that distill decades of mission, preaching into enduring spiritual guidance. His The Admirable Heart of the Most Holy Mother of God was both theology and love song, portraying Mary's heart as the first altar upon which the sacrifice of the incarnate Word was offered to the Father. It was not an abstract image for him. It was the fruit of years spent in contemplation and in the service of Mary's children, the faithful. He also began composing letters of spiritual direction for those who sought him out from afar. Nobles, religious, merchants, and widows wrote to him, and his replies were always personal, never formulaic. To a young priest worried that his parishioners seemed unmoved by the gospel, John counseled, "Preach first with your life, then with your lips. If they see you kneel in the night, when no one asks you to, they will hear your sermons even in silence." By 1680, his physical strength was clearly waning. Long journeys that once left him invigorated now required days of recovery. Yet he continued to travel when summoned, especially for the dedication of new seminaries or the establishment of new feasts of the Sacred Heart. His joy at seeing his devotions take root was unmistakable. During one celebration in honor of the Sacred Heart of Mary, he was seen standing in the sanctuary, hands lifted, his eyes brimming with tears as the congregation sang the hymn he had composed decades earlier. The final years of his ministry were marked by an almost mystical serenity. Those around him said that he seemed to live continually in the presence of Christ, often speaking of the hearts of Jesus and Mary as though they were his constant companions in the room. Even ordinary tasks, blessing bread for the poor, correcting a student's Latin, mending a torn cassock, were done with attention and gentleness that made them seem sacramental. But the years of toil had taken their toll. In early 1680, he suffered a serious illness that forced him to remain in Cannes for several weeks. When he recovered enough to walk, he resumed preaching, but friends noticed that his movements were slower, and that he sometimes had to pause mid-sermon to catch his breath. He did not complain. "The body weakens," he said, "but the heart can burn brighter than ever." That summer, he completed what would be his final mission in a small town not far from Cannes. It was a modest effort compared to great campaigns of his middle years, but bore the same mark: reconciliation among enemies, a surge in the sacraments, and a renewed sense of God's nearness. When he returned to Cannes, it was with a sense, perhaps unspoken, that his work on earth was nearly done. In the late weeks of July 1680, John's health declined sharply. Fever and weakness confined him to bed, and though he tried to dictate letters to his companions, he soon lacked the strength. Instead, he spent his hours in prayer, often murmuring invocations to the hearts of Jesus and Mary. Visitors recalled that even in his weakness, his face seemed peaceful, almost radiant. On August 19, 1680, at the age of 78, John Eudes surrendered his soul to God. His passing was quiet, attended by members of his congregation, who knelt at his bedside praying the litany of the Sacred Heart. In the days that followed, the people streamed to his coffin, many pressing rosaries and medals to his hands before carrying them home as relics. His funeral was not an occasion of pomp, but of deep, grateful love, the farewell to a man who had given himself without reserve to the service of Christ and his church. Though his body was laid in the earth, the works he had begun, the congregation of Jesus and Mary, the devotion to the Sacred Hearts, the renewal of priestly life, continued to grow, carrying forward the same flame he had tended so faithfully. Those who had known him were certain of one thing: the heart of Jesus had found in John Eudes a servant after his own heart, and that servant had completed his race with joy.